I remember the day I drove up to that old fort, a 7-figure contract sitting on the passenger seat of my black truck. My company, Avery Restoration, was about to turn a forgotten piece of history into a luxury retreat. I saw smoke curling from inside the ruined stone walls, and my stomach tightened with a mix of irritation and curiosity. My crew found him first, an old man huddled by a patched hearth, wrapped in a canvas coat, guarding the place like it was sacred ground. I stepped closer, ready to confront this trespasser, this obstacle to my grand plan. Then he looked up, and my world tilted. It was my father, Russell Avery, the man I believed had sold our family's dignity years ago. But he didn't offer an apology or an explanation. He just whispered, his voice rough with age and warning, "Don't sign anything she gave you." To understand that warning, I had to revisit the years of resentment that had built between us. The fort itself was a relic, thick stone walls stretching across the prairie, parts of its roof long collapsed. Most people saw a ruin. I saw opportunity. For nearly 15 years, I'd built a successful restoration company, turning neglected places into profitable destinations. The fort was supposed to be my crowning achievement. My Aunt Diane, my father's sister, had spent months on the paperwork. Investors were lined up. County officials were on board. The contract beside me represented millions of dollars and years of future expansion. Everything was planned. Everything, except the smoke. "We found him inside," one of my crew said, shrugging. "Guy's been living there." "Homeless?" I asked, a bitter taste in my mouth. "Looks that way." I walked through the weathered gate. The smell of wood smoke hung in the air. I noticed the patched walls immediately. New mortar blended with old stone, drainage channels cleared, loose foundation rocks reset. Whoever had done it understood preservation. A surprising level of care for an abandoned ruin. It made no sense. County records listed the fort as derelict. Then I reached the hearth. My father sat on a wooden crate, a small fire flickering beside him. His canvas coat was faded, his face covered in gray stubble, his boots worn through. For a second, I just stared. Years of anger, of feeling betrayed, surged through me. "Dad." Russell slowly looked up. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken history. I hadn't seen him in 4 years, not since our last bitter argument, not since he refused to explain where large portions of our family land had gone. I'd convinced myself he'd thrown everything away. His eyes drifted to the contract folder under my arm, and his face tightened. "You can't sign it." I laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "You disappear for years, I find you living in a fort, and that's the first thing you say?" He struggled to stand, revealing how thin he'd become. But his voice remained steady. "Don't sign anything Diane gives you." At the mention of Diane, irritation flared. My aunt had been the only constant family connection left. She handled legal matters, managed paperwork, organized the redevelopment deal. "She's the only person who's actually been helping this family," I said, my voice sharp. Russell looked away. "No." The answer was quiet, but it unsettled me. Before I could ask another question, the crunch of tires on gravel echoed across the property. A dark SUV appeared at the entrance. I frowned. Nobody had called Diane, yet she was here. She climbed out, perfect hair, pressed coat, confident smile. She looked completely out of place. "Mason," she said warmly. "I came as soon as I heard." "Heard what?" I asked, confused. That Russell was causing problems again. Her answer was too quick, her eyes flicking to my father with annoyance, not concern. "Mason, you shouldn't be listening to him." Russell remained silent. Diane sighed dramatically. "He's been doing this for years, refusing help, refusing housing, refusing common sense." "I'm standing right here," Russell said, his voice flat. Diane ignored him. "He gets confused, embarrassed, then he starts making accusations." For years, I'd accepted this explanation. Russell, the stubborn failure. Diane, the responsible one. Simple, easy. But standing in the fort, something felt wrong. The repaired walls told a different story. Carefully fitted stones, proper drainage, structural reinforcement. This work would have taken months, maybe years. A confused old man couldn't have done this alone. "Mason," Diane said sharply. We need to focus on the project. The project, not Russell, not why he was living here, not his warning. Just the project. My eyes drifted back to my father. He looked exhausted, but not defeated. More like a man protecting something. Something important. Something he couldn't afford to lose. The thought unsettled me. A cold wind moved through the fort. Russell pulled his coat tighter. I noticed how thin the fabric had become. A folded paper stuck partially out of his inner pocket. Weathered, official-looking. Russell shifted, and the paper slipped free, fluttering to the ground. I picked it up automatically. My eyes dropped to the header, County Development Office. Then I saw the name, Mason Avery. My stomach tightened. The notice was addressed to me, but the mailing address printed beneath it wasn't my office. It was Diane Avery's office. And suddenly, standing between these ruined walls and the two people telling completely different stories, I realized I might not understand any of this at all. I stared at the county notice for several seconds before I looked up. Diane's expression changed so quickly that most people would have missed it. A flicker, gone almost instantly, but I saw it. Why was this sent to your office? I asked. Diane recovered fast. Because Russell stopped opening official mail years ago. Somebody had to handle things. She reached for the paper. I folded it and slipped it into my jacket pocket before she could touch it. The movement surprised even me. For the first time that afternoon, I didn't automatically hand control back to her. The air between us shifted. Diane noticed it too. Mason, she said carefully, there's a reasonable explanation for everything. Russell laughed, a rough, tired sound. That's what she always says. Diane turned sharply toward him. You need help. No, Russell replied. You need me quiet. The words landed harder than I expected. For years, I had pictured my father as weak, defeated, a man who had squandered everything. But the look in his eyes now was different. It was the look of a man who had been fighting. And suddenly, I was no longer sure who he was fighting against. That night, I stayed at the fort. I told myself it was for practical reasons. Security, observation, evidence protection. But deep down, I knew another reason. I didn't trust leaving Russell alone anymore. The realization surprised me. Years earlier, I would have considered that impossible. We sat near the hearth after dark. Neither of us spoke much. The silence felt different now. Not comfortable, but no longer hostile. At some point, Russell handed me a folded piece of paper. I unfolded it. A letter, addressed to me, never mailed. The paper looked years old. My throat tightened. You wrote this? Russell nodded. Several times. Why didn't I get them? Russell stared into the fire. I think you already know. I did. Or at least I was beginning to. I carefully folded the letter again, without reading it. Not yet. The moment felt too heavy. Outside, wind moved across the prairie. Inside, the fort remained still. Then, just after midnight, headlights appeared beyond the ridge. Again. This time, only one vehicle. The car stopped far from the fort. Nobody got out. The engine remained running. Watching. Waiting. Almost an hour passed before it finally drove away. Neither Russell nor I slept much after that. Morning arrived, gray and cold. Laura, the county preservation officer, arrived shortly after sunrise, followed by her team. Everything was documented. Photographs, signatures, witness logs, exactly as planned. Russell stood beside the hearth, quiet, tense. I noticed his hands shaking slightly, not from age, but from emotion. This moment clearly mattered. Laura nodded. We proceed carefully. Russell looked at me, then at the witnesses. Finally, he reached down and pressed against the stone at the base of the hearth. The same stone I had noticed days earlier. It shifted. A hidden mechanism released. The stone moved outward, revealing a narrow crawl space. Dark, dusty, undisturbed. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Russell reached inside. His arm disappeared almost to the shoulder. When it emerged, he carried a metal lockbox. Old, heavy, still sealed. Laura immediately began documenting it. The preservation officer photographed everything. I stared. Years, all these years, and whatever truth had torn my family apart might be sitting inside that box. Russell placed it carefully on the hearth. Then his expression changed. The old man suddenly went pale. Very pale. His eyes locked on the crawl space. Not the box. The space behind it. A space none of us had examined yet. "That's impossible," Russell whispered. I turned. What?" Russell stepped closer, his voice barely audible now. There were supposed to be 2 boxes. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The wind moved softly through cracks in the stone walls. Somewhere outside, a loose sheet of metal rattled against an old fence post. Russell stared into the crawl space as if he had seen a ghost. "There were always 2, he said quietly. One held the ledger. The other held the amendment. Laura looked up immediately. "The trust amendment." Russell nodded. "The original copy." My stomach tightened. The missing amendment. The document everyone had been chasing. The document Diane claimed had been damaged years ago. Laura stepped closer to the opening. "Did anyone else know there were 2 boxes?" Russell hesitated. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether they ever found this place." Silence followed. Nobody needed clarification. Someone had. The missing box was proof. Laura carefully documented the crawl space before allowing anyone to remove the remaining lockbox. The preservation officer photographed every angle. Nothing was touched casually. Nothing was assumed. That alone reassured me. For the first time, the truth was being handled by people who cared about facts more than family politics. Russell sat heavily near the hearth, while Laura examined the box. His face looked exhausted. Years of carrying secrets seemed to be pressing down on him all at once. I sat beside him. Neither of us looked at the other. "You knew it was gone." Russell shook his head. "No." "Then why did you seem afraid?" Russell rubbed his hands together slowly. "Because I always knew someone might come looking." The answer unsettled me. "How long?" "A long time." "Why didn't you tell me?" Russell laughed bitterly. "You weren't listening." The words hit harder than I expected. "Because they were true." "Not entirely, but enough." I remembered ignored calls, ignored letters, years of believing the worst version of my father because it felt easier than questioning everyone else. The guilt sat quietly between us, heavy, uncomfortable, real. Laura finally opened the lockbox. Inside were dozens of documents, ledger pages, repair receipts, copies of county filings, insurance records, handwritten notes. Everything carefully wrapped against moisture. The preservation officer whistled softly. Someone spent years protecting these. Russell looked toward the hearth. I did. Nobody questioned him. Not anymore. The documents were organized with almost obsessive care. Dates matched. References matched. Maintenance expenses matched the monthly trust transfers I had discovered. Piece by piece, a different picture emerged. Russell had not been squandering money. He had been preserving the fort, quietly, patiently, while everyone else assumed he was wasting his life. The realization made me sick. I had built an entire story about my father, and most of it had been wrong. Then Laura stopped turning pages. Her expression changed. I recognized it immediately. "A discovery." "What is it?" She pulled out a folded sheet. "A trustee accounting summary," meaning it tracked distribution. The numbers were clear. Large sums of money, far more than required for the fort's maintenance, had been transferred out of the trust for years. And the recipient? Not Russell Avery, Diane Avery. The dates aligned perfectly with the missing amendment, the missing box, the missing truth. At the final review hearing, Diane arrived dressed exactly as she always had. Elegant, controlled, confident. For a brief moment, I remembered how easily I had trusted her. She had always sounded reasonable, always prepared, always ready with an explanation. That had been her greatest weapon. The hearing lasted most of the day. Experts reviewed financial transfers. Attorneys questioned timelines. Trust officers explained procedures. The evidence never pointed in one direction by itself. Together, it became impossible to ignore. Diane had redirected notices, controlled communication, used trust funds improperly, concealed the amendment, maintained authority through pressure and misinformation. When asked why she finally stopped pretending, her answer surprised nobody. "I protected this family." The room remained silent. Then, she continued. She spoke about money, about responsibility, about believing Russell was incapable, about believing I already had enough success and wealth without needing old land. She even claimed she deserved compensation for years spent managing family affairs. But every explanation led back to the same reality: control. She had decided what other people deserved, and once she gained that power, she refused to let it go. The final ruling did not arrive instantly, but immediate consequences did. Her authority over the trust was suspended and then formally removed. Access to trust accounts ended. The court approved a repayment agreement based on documented unauthorized transfers. Several assets would be liquidated to satisfy the settlement. Her role on the local Heritage Foundation board ended after official findings became public. Most painful of all, she lost the ability to speak on Russell's behalf. That power was gone forever. When the hearing ended, Diane looked older than I had ever seen her. She tried speaking to me outside. I listened, but only once. "I never hated you," she said quietly. I nodded. "I know. I thought I was protecting something." "No," I answered. "You were protecting control." For the first time, she had no response. Months later, autumn arrived in northern Montana. The fort looked different. The walls still carried their age. The stones still showed scars left by weather and time, but the place no longer felt abandoned. Workers repaired damaged sections under preservation guidelines. Training programs brought adults from across the region to learn restoration skills. The project earned far less money than the luxury development would have. I no longer cared. One afternoon, I walked through the main courtyard carrying a ring of newly cut keys. The sound of hammers echoed in the distance. Russell sat near the restored hearth. Not hidden, not isolated, not treated like a burden, simply sitting where he wanted to be. The difference mattered. I stopped beside him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Our relationship had not magically healed. Years of hurt could not disappear because paperwork finally told the truth. There were still difficult conversations, still regrets, still silence sometimes, but the silence felt different now. It no longer hid lies. Russell looked around the courtyard. "They did good work. They learned from the best," I said. A faint smile appeared, small but real. I handed him the key ring. Russell frowned. "What is this?" "The first set." "For what?" I looked toward the entrance. A simple wooden sign now stood there. Avery Fort Restoration Workshop. Russell stared at it for several seconds. His eyes grew wet again, but this time there was no shame in it. No humiliation, no fear, only recognition. Finally, after all these years, someone saw what he had been trying to protect. Not money, not property. A promise, a family history, a piece of dignity nobody had the right to erase. Russell closed his hand around the keys. His voice barely worked. "Your mother would have liked this." I swallowed hard. I think she already did. The sun began sinking behind the mountains. Golden light touched the old stone walls. For years, I had believed my father chose a crumbling fort over his own family. Now I understood the opposite was true. Russell had endured humiliation, isolation, and poverty because he refused to abandon the family when it mattered most. The fort had never been a prison. It had been a promise. And at last, neither of us had to carry it alone.